Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cottage Conversations. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. My name is Erin Carlson-Nast. I'm the director here at President Lincoln's Cottage. I have a few announcements to make before introducing our featured speaker. Our next Cottage Conversation will be held January 31st with Craig Simons, author of The Civil War at Sea. On January 3rd, we're co-sponsoring a panel discussion on the Emancipation Proclamation here at the Cottage with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and that is the companion to an anthology we'll be publishing. And I wanted to thank Sue Carruthers, who's here tonight, for being our volunteer editor for that anthology. Thank you, Sue. On December 31st, we're hosting a New Year's celebration called Freedom's Eve, to mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. To learn more about that, visit our website, lincolncottage.org. And I also wanted to acknowledge the fact that tonight is Mary Todd Lincoln's birthday. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Louis Major to talk about his latest book, Lincoln's 100 Days, the Emancipation Proclamation and the War for the Union. Dr. Major will be signing books in the library immediately following the program. He is a cultural historian and professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University, and he has authored a number of books, including 1831, Year of Eclipse, The Soiling of Old Glory, and The Civil War, A Concise History. He also garnered substantial New Jersey cred by authoring Runaway Dream, a chronicle of the Bruce Springsteen album, Born to Run. Major's essays and reviews have appeared in the American Scholar, the New York Times, Chronicle of Higher Education Review, Slate, and Salon. I hope you all have had a chance to see the rare signed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation currently on display in the Robert H. Smith Visitor Education Center just across here from the Cottage. It contains the language we all consider familiar in the proclamation. But of course, that version was the culmination of months of focused effort, many of them taking place right here in the Cottage. And those months were influenced by years of developing an idea and a course of action in response to the political and economic climate of Lincoln's time. In Lincoln's 100 Days, Major makes it perfectly clear that the proclamation did not appear out of thin air on December 31st, 1862, as so many people seem prone to thinking today. He draws us in by setting the stage for the ultimatum issued on September 22nd, the preliminary proclamation, and through an intensive series of events, military, political, and personal, that over the next 100 days led to Lincoln enacting the proclamation on New Year's Day. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Louis Major.
Thank you, Erin, for that introduction. I couldn't be more thrilled to be speaking in this place at this moment. To be speaking at Lincoln's Cottage in December of 2012, 150 years from this moment of anticipation that Americans were experiencing. Anxiety, dread, hopefulness, exultation, fear. What would happen on January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed? Many people spent 3 months, those 100 days, between September 22nd and January 1st, begging the president, don't do it. Don't sign it. Retract it. You still have time to step back. And part of what I would like to do today is tell you some of that story, the story that really leads up to this moment as the nation waited for midnight, December 31st. So excited was the anticipation that Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist, writes an essay in The Atlantic about this, and he says, "Do not let the dying die until their ears have heard this clarion sound of emancipation." But it took a while to get there. It took a while to get to January 1st, 1863. And from the start of the war, it drove abolitionists and radical Republicans crazy. What was this man waiting for? After all, the Republican Party was known to be an anti-slavery party. They were certainly opposed to the expansion of slavery. Lincoln had always been anti-slavery. He said, "I am naturally anti-slavery. I cannot believe a time when I did not think and feel so." A lot of people then called him out on it, in effect, in April of 1861, and begged him, pleaded with him, to take action against slavery. Charles Sumner, the radical senator from Massachusetts, he came to the White House on a regular basis. He's constantly barging into the White House to try and get Lincoln to move. In fact, on July 4th, 1862, he doesn't come once, but he comes twice, begging him to consecrate the day, July 4th, as a day of emancipation. And yet, Lincoln doesn't act. Well, there's good reason for him not to act, and we need to understand that. That's part of the historical context for appreciating what he does and when he does it. He was a very deliberate man. He would think through problems very carefully, never acting rashly. And there are a number of reasons why he couldn't act in April or May or June or even the following spring of 1862 against slavery. One was very simple. He didn't have the constitutional authority to do so. And he reminded people time and again that that was the case. His oath of office bound him to uphold the Constitution, and like it or not, slavery was a state institution, governed by state laws. And as President of the United States, he could not break his constitutional oath of office and just act against slavery, particularly because he never recognized the legitimacy of the Confederacy. They were insurgents. They were in rebellion. They were under the control of other authorities, but they still maintained their constitutional rights as part of the United States. It would take time for Lincoln to develop a different path, a different doctrine by which he could attack slavery legally, hopefully constitutionally in his mind, and that was not using his powers as President of the United States. He was using his powers as Commander-in-Chief. And we can watch this doctrine of military necessity emerge. The Solicitor General writes a report on the war powers of the President. People begin to realize that, wait a minute, the enslaved are being used to help the Confederate effort in a number of different ways, not as soldiers, but by providing work and by being on the plantations. To liberate them is to take some power away from the Confederacy and bring it to the Union. So that becomes the lever, the doctrine, by which when he acts, he can finally act. But he's got other problems besides constitutional scruples. He's got the problem of the border states. Because even if he could act against slavery, he couldn't act against slavery in those states that remained in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. And he feared, dreaded what would happen should he act precipitously against slavery, and those states would try and leave the Union and join the Confederacy. It's not clear that he actually ever said it, but it's a great quote that captures something about Lincoln and the man. He said, he's quoted as having said, "I would love to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." What he did say in a letter is to lose Kentucky is to lose the whole game. And so over and over again in those first 18 months of war, what is he doing? He's meeting with these border state representatives, and he's saying to them, he's pleading with them, please take action against slavery. Gradual emancipation, compensated emancipation, whatever you have to do it. Because he believed that if those border states would take action to abolish slavery while the war was raging, it would clear the field to then act against slavery in the Confederacy. As it turns out, it would be inverted. He would finally tire of time and again making these offers to the border states, only to be rejected, and would come to realize that if he acted against slavery in the Confederacy, if slavery was abolished in those areas, it could not stand much longer in those four states. It would marginalize them. People would quote the poem from Alexander Pope, Essay on Man, any link in the chain broken destroys the entire chain. And so over time, again, the issue here is time and growth and changing one's mind over time about issues. Lincoln comes to realize, okay, he can act. But we're not done by any stretch with the headaches that this man is facing as president, and we have to recover that. He's president, he's a politician in a time of unprecedented struggle in America. So he has diplomatic considerations. What if England were to come into the war on behalf of the Confederacy? that too would mean game over. England, which had such deep financial interests in cotton, and the aristocracy of England, which sort of disdained in lots of ways what they thought was a power grab going on by Lincoln and his administration. So there's this delicate, extended diplomatic dance that's taking place until such time, again, as Lincoln is convinced that by acting against slavery, it will serve to keep Europe out of the conflict rather than bring them in. Another concern, the soldiers. 2/5 of the men were from Democratic backgrounds. If they were from Democratic backgrounds, there's a good chance that they didn't want to make this into a war about slavery. There was a good chance that they shared some of the racialist assumptions of the time, a tremendous amount of anxiety about what would happen if slavery was abolished. And there's a lot of discussion of these men, if Lincoln acts against slavery prematurely, mutinying, throwing down their arms. Well, what good would that do? To finally act against slavery, only to lose the military force that you have that's trying to win the war. Here again is where experience is so important. One of the discoveries, if you will, one of the joys I had in reading the letters and the diaries, and we're so lucky that the Civil War was a written war, and that we have so many of these texts and so many of these documents, is you can follow the soldiers as they change their minds. And that's really what this story is all about. The story is about being open to events and to changing your mind in response to those events. Well, how many of these soldiers had ever seen a black person? How many of these soldiers had any idea whatsoever what was entailed in slavery? And they recount story after story of these men going south and coming up against a certain reality that makes them change their minds. I'll just read you very briefly the reflections of a private in the 103rd Illinois named Charles Wills. And here's what he writes. He says, "I never thought I would, but I'm getting strongly in favor of arming them." He's talking about arming black men as soldiers, authorizing their enlistment into the army. He says, "I'm getting strongly in favor of arming them, and I'm becoming so blind that I can't see why they will not make soldiers. How queer. A year ago, last January, I didn't like to hear anything of emancipation. Last fall, I accepted confiscation of rebels' Negroes quietly. In January, I took to emancipation readily. And now, I believe in arming the Negroes." Wills is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of soldiers who, again, had the experience of changing their minds, much as this man, Abraham Lincoln, had to go through a process to change his mind. There's one more factor that has to be addressed, and that's the anxiety of what would happen if slavery was abolished. Yes, Lincoln shared many of the racial assumptions of his day. He had the anxiety that whites and blacks might not be able to live peaceably together, might not be able to coexist. It's why he was a proponent of colonization. Scheme begun in 1816, 1817, for the voluntary deportation of blacks to other countries. Liberia, its capital Monrovia, is founded as such a colony. And Lincoln is very supportive of various schemes to do this. Not out of the kind of horrific, I would argue, there are different kinds of racism, that some people like to see the extermination of the African race entirely, but out of concern for both their well-being as well as the well-being of whites. He's going to continue to think through that problem.